You ever stop and wonder how we can be so sure that the ancient texts we read today are what the authors actually wrote? From philosophy to history to scripture? Well, let's get into it because the answer is this incredible story of historical detective work.
Okay, let's start with a big one, Plato. We study his philosophy, we quote his ideas. His work is basically foundational to Western thought. But how do we really know that the words in our books today are the same words he was writing down way back around 400 BC?
Because here's the thing, and this might shock you, we don't have a single document that Plato actually wrote himself. Not one. Every single one of his original manuscripts, what scholars call an autograph, has been completely lost to time.
So that leads to a pretty obvious question, right? Okay, what about something as important as the New Testament? Surely, for a text that central to world history, we must have the originals for that.
Nope. It is the exact same problem. We don't have a single original letter from the Apostle Paul or any of the original Gospels. And you know what? This is true for pretty much all literature from the ancient world. So, how can historians trust any of it?
Well, the good news is they aren't just guessing. There's a whole scholarly method, a science really, that's dedicated to solving this exact problem, to piecing together the past from all the copies that we do have.
It's called textual criticism. Now, that name might sound a little negative, like we're about to tear these texts apart, but it's not about criticizing in that sense. It's actually a really rigorous, objective process that's used for all ancient documents, whether we're talking about Homer, Julius Caesar, or the Bible.
So how does it actually work? Let's use the Roman historian Tacitus as a quick case study. First, scholars do a linguistic analysis. Does the Latin he used actually match the grammar and vocabulary from the first century? For Tacitus, it's a big yes. Second, they hunt for cross-references. Did other ancient writers quote his work? Yep, guys like Orosius quote passages that match up perfectly with the copies we have today. And third, they examine the manuscripts themselves. Sometimes the way a copy from the 9th century is laid out, even the mistakes in it can prove that it was copied from a much, much older version.
And because this method is so well established, the default position for scholars is to trust the manuscript tradition unless there's some really compelling evidence not to. As one historian on Reddit put it, the burden of proof is actually on the person who wants to discredit the text, not the person who affirms it. So, this is the crucial part. We can take this objective standard and apply it across the board to all ancient literature. It's called the bibliographical test, and this is where the evidence starts to get really, really interesting. This test basically asks two simple but really powerful questions. First, how many manuscript copies do we actually have to compare with each other? I mean, the more copies you have, the easier it is to cross-reference them and weed out any scribal errors. And second, what's the time gap? How long is it between when the original was written and our earliest surviving copy was made? Because, a shorter gap means less time for mistakes to creep in.
Okay, so let's tackle that first question, manuscript quantity. For the Greek New Testament alone, the number of manuscripts that scholars have found and cataloged is over 5,795, and that number keeps going up.
And this is where the comparison just becomes wow. The nearly 6,000 Greek manuscripts for the New Testament just completely dwarf other major works. Homer's Iliad, which was like the Bible for the ancient Greeks, comes in second place with under 2,000 copies. Caesar's famous Gallic War, only about 250. The difference isn't just big, it's honestly staggering.
Now for that second question, the time gap. And looking at this chart, the data is just as dramatic. For Plato, we're talking a gap of about 1,300 years. For Tacitus, 750 years. Even for Homer, it's a 400-year gap. But then you look at the New Testament, and it is in a completely different ballpark. We have fragments that date as early as 125 AD. That leaves a gap of just a few decades, maybe 25 to 50 years. That's well within the lifetime of people who were around when the originals were written.
But believe it or not, the evidence doesn't even stop with all those Greek manuscripts. It's actually much broader and deeper, which gives these textual detectives even more data to work with.
See, very early in its history, the New Testament was translated into other languages. So we have thousands of manuscript copies in languages like Armenian and Coptic, and thousands more in Latin, Syriac, you name it. When you add all these up, it gives scholars tens of thousands of additional documents to cross-check. It creates this incredibly rich web of evidence for confirming what the original text said.
And then there's one more layer, the writings of the early church leaders. They quoted the New Testament constantly in their letters and sermons. They quoted it so much, in fact, that the famous scholars Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman said that even if we lost every single manuscript of the Bible, we could still reconstruct almost the entire New Testament just from their quotations alone.
So after we've looked at the methods and we've seen this just mountain of manuscript evidence, what's the conclusion? What are the big takeaways from all this historical detective work?
All right, let's just recap the key points. First, no original copies survive for any ancient work. That's just a fact of history. Second, textual criticism is the standard, accepted historical method for piecing the originals back together. Third, when you put the texts side by side, the New Testament is supported by just an exponentially greater quantity of manuscripts. And fourth, that time gap for the New Testament is dramatically, exceptionally shorter than for any other text from the ancient world.
Now, this next point is absolutely critical. We have to be crystal clear about what this means and what it doesn't mean. This entire field of textual criticism is not about proving whether the events in a document actually happened or if its claims are true. The sole purpose is to figure out, with as much certainty as possible, what the original document actually said, and based on the evidence, historians can be exceptionally confident about the wording of the New Testament text that we have today.
And so that leaves us with one final fascinating question to think about. The evidence itself doesn't force you to believe anything about the content of the text, but when one single document from the ancient world was copied, translated, quoted, and preserved on a scale that is just orders of magnitude greater than any other, what does that historical fact alone tell us about its journey through the centuries?